Hi guys, welcome back to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host, as always, Steve Hall. Today I'm excited to chat with Dr. Milo Wolf, an expert in hypertrophy and the role of range of motion as it pertains to muscle growth. Milo will be shedding light on the latest research surrounding range of motion as it pertains to hypertrophy, will explore key findings and uncover practical applications for optimizing muscle growth. Furthermore, Milo will share his unique approach to drawing principles from research and integrating it into your programming. But that's not all. We'll also delve into controversial topics, such as exercises that bias certain positions, and explore Milo's perspective on using exercises that bias specifically the short position. As a reminder, to keep getting such fantastic guests, we need your help. Many of you listen regularly but aren't subscribed, and it'll be awesome if you could hit that subscribe button, and that way you'll never miss an episode. And if you're subscribed, thank you. We would love if you could share an episode on social media, give us a solid review, and leave a comment if you can. Thank you. With that said, get ready to dive into the world of range of motion and hypertrophy with Milo Wolf. Let's jump right in. So Milo, I was just saying to you off air, it's been almost a year, I can't believe this, since we've spoken about lengthened partials on the podcast, as the joke goes on Muscle and Feels, which is yours and Pac's podcast, which I enjoy listening to. You can't go a podcast without talking about it, and every podcast turns into a lengthened partials podcast. And we are going to be talking about that heavily. You were on 5 months ago, because we're talking about that 52 set study, another controversial one with Dr. Pac and Brad Schoenfeld as well. And so today we're going to just kind of catch up on the literature as a whole, because I think it feels like it's maybe moving fast. I don't know if it necessarily is, but there's certainly, at least within the evidence-based space, there's quite a lot of content coming out about it and discussions surrounding it, debates and things like this. And I think at least maybe some of the people that tune into the podcast, tune into what you're doing, like just a summary of where we're at so far would be super handy. And then we can kind of dig into that. So am I right in saying we now have actually, like, regarding partials to versus full range of motion, we have 4 studies that have specifically been done, 1 conference paper, and you're currently looking at biceps and triceps partials versus full ROM as well. Is that where we're at?
Yeah, that's correct. So I think, first of all, thank you for having me again. I'll quickly break down the research. So we have 5 studies now. As you mentioned, one of them is currently a conference abstract. But of these 5 studies, 4 have found more hypertrophy from lengthened partials. 1 has found no difference between lengthened partials and full range of motion. Now, in 2023, the most recent study that we potentially hadn't spoken about last time we talked about lengthened partials was a conference abstract by Mao and colleagues, the same research group that did the infamous leg curl study and the infamous overhead extension and pushdown study. They also did a study comparing lengthened partials to a full range of motion on the multi-hip machine. Specifically, they kind of performed the movement like an RDL, where they kept their knees pretty extended, minimizing knee bend, but just extending the hip, right? So kind of like an RDL or hip hinge type movement. And they looked at hypertrophy of all 4 heads of the hamstrings, I believe, and the gluteus maximus as well. And basically, by comparing lengthened partials, where they were only doing the stretched half of the movement, to a full range of motion, they observed around twice as much hypertrophy in pretty much all of the muscle groups being observed, which is kind of in line with some of the other evidence, where Pedrosa and colleagues found more hypertrophy with lengthened partials by and large. Goto and colleagues, the skull crusher study, also found more hypertrophy from doing partials versus a full range of motion, although that study is a bit tricky because ultimately, and this is something I perhaps should have clarified more in earlier appearances, the Goto study is a bit tricky because they compare sort of mid-length partials to a full range of motion. So kind of doing the skull crusher, keeping constant tension, to doing a full range of motion. If you just categorize things into, did the partial range of motion group train at longer muscle lengths or shorter muscle lengths than the full range of motion group? They did train at slightly longer muscle lengths, but it's more like a mid-length partial to a full range of motion comparison. Then we have the Cassiano study. That was the study, I think, also published last year, where they compared full range of motion calf raises to lengthened partials to shortened partials and found about twice as much hypertrophy in the calves at both sites measured for lengthened partial versus full range of motion, and even more of a difference when comparing, say, lengthened partials to shortened partials. And finally, you have the Workhausen study, which was a study on the leg press, where they compared concentric only leg pressing with a very small range of motion using lengthened partials, or with a full range of motion. Neither group saw any hypertrophy, so That's not ideal from a research perspective when you want to see, does intervention A cause more hypertrophy than intervention B? And neither causes hypertrophy. It's not great. To quote Dr. Mike Israetel as an analogy, if you're trying to see which car is fastest between two cars, but neither of them actually takes off the starting line, you can't really draw that comparison. Um, so yeah, those are the 5 studies. By and large, I think there is growing support for lengthened partials being potentially better for hypertrophy than a full range of motion. Um, there are some cool studies I've been involved in that I can speak on that are not yet published or even pre-printed. So you're getting this very ahead of print. But I can talk about those if you'd like.
Yeah, I would be very interested in those. One quick question is, with the one that didn't see any growth with the leg press, do you have any insights to why that might have been?
Yeah. Um, I mean, for one, the approach being taken of concentric only training, probably not ideal. Like, if you just compare concentric only training to eccentric only training, you do generally see more muscle growth when you actually incorporate the eccentric. So the research design may not have been ideal for hypertrophy. I think the tempo being used was very explosive as well. So, like, the time under tension being presented per set, if I recall correctly, might not have been quite sufficient to really cause much growth. So, compared to other studies we have in the skull crusher, in the calf raise, in the leg extension, and now even in the multi-hip machine, where they used a more reasonable tempo, and by reasonable I mean something we'd actually use in practice, I don't think it's the best study to look at the question. But certainly, I think it would be disingenuous to ignore it altogether. So I think it's worth presenting, even though the protocol being used wasn't ideal or wasn't what we would do in practice for hypertrophy.
Yeah.
But yeah, so to move on to the studies I'd like to speak about. So I'm involved in several studies at the moment on range of motion, of which we don't have the results yet. But there have been 3 studies that I've been involved in where we do have the results, and these haven't been published yet. So essentially, Stian Larsen, a researcher up in Denmark. I always forget which one of the Scandinavian countries. I am very poor with a memory, but he's a researcher up in Scandinavia. Let's put it that way. And back in around September-ish, we collaborated on designing a few studies and just kind of making sure that we're designing these studies to really answer some questions that are important to us as lifters as far as the muscle length, the stretch, and everything else goes. And we kind of came to 3 research questions that we were going to investigate in 3 different muscle groups. So we used a within participant design, meaning that one limb was being trained separately from the other. So essentially factors like nutrition, sleep, stress aren't a confounder that could be influencing one group a different way from the other, and thus potentially causing the results. And so we got about 30 participants untrained, because those are the easiest ones to get, to look at 3 different research questions. I'll sort of describe them one by one. First, in the quads, we looked at the impact of hip angle during the leg extension on quadricep growth. So there's been one study recently looking at the effects of hip angle, like whether you extend your hip more or whether you sort of sit down and have more hip flexion essentially during the leg extension on activation, and that was measured by T2 MRI at the time. And they basically found, oh, maybe extending your hips a bit more and therefore stretching out the rectus femoris could cause greater activation in a muscle, which could cause greater hypertrophy. But as far as like extending your hips, like you see Tom Platz do in his old training videos, we didn't have any studies on that. And so we were comparing the effect of hip angle on hypertrophy of the rectus femoris, that's the muscle of the quads that actually inserts at the hip, which means that when you extend your hips more, like those old Tom Platz videos, you're lengthening the rectus femoris more. To sort of flexing them more to a 90-degree angle, which is what most people end up doing when they're just sitting down in a leg extension. So we compared 40 degrees of hip flexion to 90 degrees of hip flexion. This has implications for a few things. One, it has implications for, is the leg extension the best exercise ever for hypertrophy, which I've spoken on previously. And 2, whether or not modifying leg extension slightly or just using a better machine that allows you to extend your hips would make it better for hypertrophy. We measured hypertrophy at 4 sites across 2 muscles. Specifically, we measured the rectus femoris and the vastus lateralis. The vastus lateralis only extends the knee, so whether your hip is more extended or more flexed shouldn't impact hypertrophy. We also measured the rectus femoris. For the rectus femoris, since it flexes the hip, if we extend the hips more, that should stretch it more, and based on all the research I've been involved in, we would expect more hypertrophy. And we measured hypertrophy of these two muscles at both a proximal and a more distal site. Proximal just means closer to the hip, and distal closer to the knee. And basically, across 10 weeks of training, we saw the following results. When doing leg extensions with your hips more extended, aka stretching the rectus femoris more, we did observe more rectus femoris hypertrophy and the same roughly vastus lateralis hypertrophy. Specifically at the distal site for the rectus femoris, we observed around 50% more hypertrophy. And then at the proximal site, we observed around 170% more hypertrophy. So like a pretty substantial difference, like close to 3 times as much hypertrophy when extending the hips versus keeping them more flexed as you would during most leg extensions. Whereas for the vastus lateralis, as you would expect, essentially no differences in hypertrophy, whether at the proximal site or at the distal site. And so just to touch on this kind of study first, this suggests to me a few things. One, good leg extension machines are going to be a lot better than bad leg extension machines. Like if a leg extension machine doesn't allow you to get much past like 90 degrees of knee flexion, and it kind of forces you into being at around 90 degrees of hip flexion, the leg extension is functionally a shortened partial, right? Especially for the rectus femoris, but also for the quads at large. Most people can get about 150 degrees or so of knee flexion, and most leg extensions only get you about 90. So you're missing out on about 60-ish degrees of knee flexion that would be stretching the quads out more that you are just not getting in most leg extension machines. Then you also have the factor that your hips are quite flexed, which further shortens the rectus femoris, so it's kind of a double whammy as far as muscle length goes. And finally, most bad leg extension machines have the added downside of the resistance curve being way harder in the peak squeeze than at the bottom. At the bottom, most people can probably rep out the full stack for many reps. But if you include the top portion, all of a sudden you can't probably get that many reps. So the leg extension, as it's usually being performed with both machines, is just hardest at short muscle lengths, which is also not what we want. But at the very least, what this study suggested is that, hey, if your hips are quite flexed during leg extension and you don't have a great leg extension machine, it may not be the best exercise. It also suggests, one, that there's more support for longer muscle length training now. It's another study in the sort of like general rubric of longer muscle length training is good for hypertrophy. But two, and this is a bit more speculative because we ultimately didn't draw this comparison, but I do think that exercises like sissy squats and reverse Nordic curls are likely just better exercises for hypertrophy than leg extension. So that's another takeaway is that, hey, if you have to pick between 2 exercises and all else being equal, one stretches a muscle group more and one doesn't, the one that stretches it is likely better for hypertrophy. There are definitely other considerations, but I think in the context of hypertrophy training, people often overemphasize other considerations, like loadability, for example, right? If you want to achieve maximum hypertrophy, you want to be able to get at least 5 reps per set with a given exercise. And on the top end of that, you probably don't want to need to do more than about 50 reps, right? Like if you need to do more than 50 reps to get close to failure on movement and you can't add load, that is probably just too light for you to get close to failure or to get an optimal hypertrophy stimulus on a per set basis. But like, Steve, there's just not that many exercises that don't achieve this super broad criterion. Like, most people can do some version of the sissy squat for at least 5 reps. Most people can do some version of the reverse Nordic curl for at least 5 reps. Most people can do the leg extension for between 5 and 50 reps. Like, almost all exercises you ever do in the gym, especially with some modification to technique, can be done to failure somewhere between 5 and 50 reps. Like, loadability is kind of one of those theoretical concerns, but most of the time it's not really a practical concern. So yeah, like I think that's where I kind of see an issue with people defending certain movements when in reality from the research we don't know a whole lot, and the actual criteria for exercise selection are remarkably lenient. A lot of things can work. One of the only things that we actually have some confidence in now is that the lengthened position is important. So it's not something you want to ignore in your exercise selection. So that's study number 1. Is there anything that you want to ask about those findings? Because I know these are quite interesting.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting, and it confirms my bias of how I've been performing my leg extensions, which I also do sissy squats in my program as well, but adding yoga blocks to kind of get more range of motion there, reclining the seat as far back as possible so that I'm in that upright torso position with the hips flexed so they can be a bit more extended. And I use a Strive. You came to Yorkies, so you saw some of the kit. They've got Strive, so I can bias it hardest in that lengthened position, and I just skip the short position altogether anyway. So that's how I've been performing it. And I think based off that research, kind of confirms that that's a great way to approach a leg extension. But I like the further kind of expanding that thought process of, okay, so clearly here in this study, we showed stretching the rectus femoris even more, saw much more growth. So are there other exercises where we can get a loaded stretch position as well? And like you said, reverse Nordics, sissy squats, you can. I guess there's a little bit more of a skill component with those lifts, but it's nothing that I think you can't do. But it's funny because I've seen you doing the reverse Nordics and I've tried them. And I will say for me, my ankles kill on that movement. Now there probably are modifications for that, but I just tried it and I was like, whoa, I can't, my ankle mobility is terrible.
Yeah, no, for sure. And that is with certain movements like the reverse Nordic curl and the sissy squat. It did take me about 2 weeks for them to start feeling comfortable. Like with many movements, I think that, and when you first start lifting, in fact, everything feels like awful, right? Like every movement you do is like, this feels a bit odd in my elbow or something. But then as you start to do it week upon week, for me at least, and for most people I've coached through the movement, it's gotten better. I just think that many of the things we traditionally think are important for exercise selection, we just don't have evidence for. Now, that's not to say that there's for sure not an effect there, because it might just be absence of evidence versus evidence of absence. But things like stability, right? Things like the degree of technique involvement or how much technique breakdown can occur. Things like those, you would think, based on the way some people speak about it, that we have a ton of evidence for it influencing hypertrophy. And that the small differences in how stable an exercise is going to for sure impact the hypertrophy stimulus. And the truth is, we just don't have that research. Like, it's just not there. Like, we have a study or two on stability for hypertrophy, and the results aren't even consistent there. Like, if anything, there was one study where they found more hypertrophy from less stable training. Like, people claiming that stability is this huge concern, or people claiming that loadability is this huge concern, or people claiming that any other number of factors are this huge concern, oftentimes that isn't really evidence-based. And so that's why I probably make such a big point of muscle length during training, is that it's one of the few things we actually have evidence on. And so, like, why are we denying the importance of it and prioritizing other factors that we don't have evidence on yet? I don't know. That's just my view. But certainly, like, the leg extension will grow muscle. Like, that's never been the claim. But certainly the way you're modifying it, where you can load the lengthened position more, where you're extending your hips, where you're using yoga pads to get even more range of motion, all of those things will likely make it more effective. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm very interested by the stability question, because that's one I've definitely spoken about, and it theoretically makes so much sense in my head. I can produce more force. I'm not kind of losing tension through being unstable, and so I can take that muscle closer to failure or whatever. I can use more kind of load, and that is often a critique of, like, say, a sissy squat, for example. But I think you can make it practically not an issue, like the stability thing. Like, you're not trying to load a sissy squat to do like a 5 rep max, for example, right?
Correct. And also, like, you do realize that you can literally just hold on to something for mild support in the case that you tip over or whatever. Like, that
please
takes
do
care of a lot of those issues. Like, it's not as though you're training to perform the perfectly aesthetic sissy squat. You're training to get your quads close to failure. And small modifications will largely take care of that issue. It's really not difficult. So I almost think nowadays that, like, the stretch, reasonable loadability, taking the target muscle close to failure, and time efficiency are kind of the main things to look for in exercise, where certain exercises are just wildly time inefficient. And for most people who have some sort of time constraint or who have other things going on in life, like, there are straight up better exercises. So, like, setting up a conventional deadlift from scratch, or like a deficit deadlift, or like a block deadlift, or what have you, or hip thrust, even like barbell hip thrust, if you're reasonably strong, that's going to take you forever. Whereas if you just set up like a dumbbell split squat, okay, I grab 2 dumbbells, I find a bench, and I can start doing them with about a minute of getting warmed up and everything else. So yeah, those are just considerations I tend to prioritize nowadays when it comes to exercise selection.
And I think that's great. One final thing on the sissy squats and the kind of rectus femoris. Have you used one of the like a machine sissy squat where you have your ankles hooked in and you can kind of sit back? I guess
I have not.
When I'm thinking about practically what to apply from that research is a lot of people have that 90-degree torso angle, whereas
Yep.
you can actually stretch by, it makes it a hell of a lot harder because you also increase like the moment arm and everything, but
Yep.
you can increase that range of motion by like, yeah, just shifting your torso back.
Yep, absolutely. I've said this for a while now, I think. Maybe not publicly because it's such a niche question, but I don't think the sissy squat machine is as good as the non-machine version. Just because in a non-machine version, you can fully extend your hips, get an even deeper stretch on the rectus femoris. And by the way, when it comes to extending your hips fully and even extending the spine a bit more, like purposely extending the spine and sort of getting your chest out, that also increases the moment arm, which theoretically would then increase how much tension there is at the very bottom relative to at the very top. So yeah, I'm all for it. If you
Yeah.
like, I can move on to the other two studies.
Let's go for it.
All right. First, we have a study in the calves, which is the first study to ever look at the idea of doing forced lengthened partials after failure. So essentially, we compared, again, within participant design, the effects of doing single leg Smith machine calf raises, either ending the set when they couldn't get another full rep, like getting sort of onto those tippy toes, or with the other leg, going past failure and just doing partials, either until they couldn't get out of that full stretch at all anymore, or until they were like, yeah, I'm out. Because, like, honestly, about halfway through the study, we had to make the decision to change the criteria for failure in that condition because people were finding it so hard to push until they couldn't even move out of that stretch position anymore. Because that was the criteria at first. That was where we were aiming to have them end the set, was when they even couldn't move out of that fully lengthened position anymore. So essentially, they just ended the set when they either couldn't do that anymore or when they decided, look, I'm out. Like the pain was too much to bear. Correct. Yes. And essentially, we again used a within participant design so that nutritional factors, stress and sleep, etc., wouldn't be a component. And we observed around 50% more hypertrophy when doing those partials after failure compared to just ending the set when they couldn't get another full rep in the gastroc specifically. So it's the first study on doing lengthened partials after failure, kind of as a lengthened superset. I think I've called it before, where you do lengthened partials as a way to extend the set when you can't get another full rep on a movement that is very shortened biased in the sense that it is hardest in that shortened position. And indeed, it seemed to cause more hypertrophy. Now, do I recommend this approach as like a blanket approach for everyone trying to incorporate lengthened partials? No, because it's the first study on the topic, and it might be the case that it only applies to movements that are very shortened biased, or maybe even only in the calves or what have you. But it certainly suggests that, hey, if you do want to incorporate some lengthened training into your routine and you don't like doing lengthened partials as a standalone technique, you can do lengthened supersets or just do some partials at the end of your set, and you'll probably still get a benefit. I'm not sure it would be as much of a benefit as just doing partials, but at least the study suggests you will get a benefit. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's really cool because I know that's been probably the most widely used way of lengthened partials is on the movements where it's easiest in that stretch position where we're generally strongest. They kind of continue to just rep out until the range of motion drops off. But it hasn't been researched. I know that's been one of the things you've talked about. Is like, why maybe you're not applying what we found in research the most evidence-based way. But we've got now this study where they did that with the calves, and we have previous studies where they've just done partials. Can you use those? I don't know, I suppose because it's different participants and there's changes in variables and things, but from looking at the results from each, can you try and infer, hey, we're better off doing full ROM than partials or just straight up partials?
Oh man, that's tricky. So that's tricky for a couple of reasons. One, obviously not the same study, and two, it is only comparing one study to another. Are you talking about the Cassiano calf study now? Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, in that study, they observed twice as much hypertrophy when doing lengthened partials with 4 range of motion, whereas in our case, we observed 50% more. Additionally, in our study, we used a within participant design, so I'm inclined to think that our estimate might be a bit more accurate, just because like it essentially means that we have closer to 30 participants per group, as opposed to like the relatively smaller sample size that they had in Cassiano's study. But if you just look at the effect size, around twice as much hypertrophy versus an additional 50% hypertrophy, it's super speculative, but it might be like, oh, you're getting half the benefit or what have you. Like it's super speculative for so many reasons. Like it's just one study and one study, but it certainly does align with what I tend to think happens, which is the more emphasis you can put on the stretch, at least to a certain point within the confines of what we studied, which is to say, like, most studies don't have you in like the most stretched position. Most studies have you do one exercise and what have you. But at least within the context of those confines, right, where we've only looked at single exercises and usually relatively lengthened positions, it does seem like spending more time in the stretch position is better for hypertrophy than spending less time. And this kind of aligns with that, where doing partials after failure, probably not as much of an emphasis on the stretch as if you just did partials, right? And indeed, we saw a bit more hypertrophy in the Cassiano study compared to this one. So maybe there's something there. At the very least, it doesn't go directly against what I thought would happen.
Yeah. Yeah, that's cool. It kind of, I think the way I'm looking is like the more time we can spend in that lengthened range, this kind of seems to be better so far. I think that's a fair enough kind of perception to take from the studies, but we just can't hold it too strongly. So I think you presented that really well.
Right. Yeah, that's pretty much what I think as well. And then the final study was in the biceps. Again, using a within participant design, they compared doing cable curls with both arms, but with one twist. In both conditions, the resistance curve was set up to be hardest at the very bottom. So the cable was orthogonal to the line of pull at the very bottom. So kind of the cable was horizontal, and that kind of creates the most tension at the very bottom, where the moment arm is greatest at the very bottom, right? So in both conditions, the resistance was we tried to set it up so that it was hardest in the stretch position. The difference between the two conditions, or the way the two arms were being trained, was that with one arm, the arm was hyperextended as far back as they could. And we actually measured the angle for hyperextension. Participants on average got it to about 40 or 45 degrees of hyperextension. So kind of a 40 or 45-degree angle between your upper arm and your torso. Whereas in the other condition, with the other arm, the arm was kept neutral by their side, right? So in both conditions, we're talking about using a full range of motion. We're talking about a resistance curve that is lengthened biased in terms of it is hardest in a lengthened position. And the research question was essentially, when you already have a movement that is quite lengthened biased, does taking that to the next level by hyperextending the shoulder and creating even more of a stretch in terms of muscle length cause more hypertrophy? And basically, it didn't really, no. And that's kind of in line with at least one other study by Zavalita Kora and colleagues, where they compared the preach curl to the incline curl, or essentially an exercise where muscle length is being prioritized, but there's not necessarily tension in that stretch position. That's the incline curl. Even though you're getting a deeper stretch because your shoulder is hyperextended, so your biceps are being stretched out more, you're not really getting much tension at the bottom position, right? And in fact, the hardest position, at least from a moment arm perspective, is when your forearm is parallel to the ground. So pretty close to the peak squeeze, actually. Versus a preacher curl, where yes, your arm is in front of you, so your shoulder is flexed, which means your biceps are a bit more shortened. But the hardest part of the movement is relatively close to the bottom position. When your forearm is parallel to the ground, when the moment arm is greatest, that's actually pretty close to the stretch position for the movement. And so essentially, that was a comparison of more muscle length, less tension, and less muscle length, more tension. And again, tension in the context of the stretch position. And in that study, they saw, if anything, more hypertrophy from the preacher curl. And so when you combine those results with the results by our group now, you would tend to think that, hey, if you have the choice between just prioritizing getting a deeper stretch versus just prioritizing placing more tension there in that relatively stretched position, it seems like the tension component is pretty important. And importantly, that kind of goes against what many people have been saying nowadays, which is that lengthened partials cause stretch-mediated hypertrophy. Like countless influencers nowadays, and I'm not saying this disparagingly, by the way, I'm an influencer. I'm not meaning like you're a bad person for being an influencer, but I am saying that many people nowadays are referring to lengthened partials or lengthened training as causing stretch-mediated hypertrophy. And I've got a whole article coming out on Strong by Science as to why that might not be the case. But the long story short is the term stretch-mediated hypertrophy is an important one to keep in mind as you navigate this, because it originated from animal studies in the 70s, where essentially animals were being stretched out with relatively high resistances at maximal muscle lengths for often between like an hour a day to 24 hours a day for like weeks on end. And in those studies, they observed like insane hypertrophy. In terms of effect sizes, I'm talking about effect sizes of like 8 or 9. For context, in the average resistance training study in humans, we see an effect size of about 0.3. So like the magnitude of effect is absolutely insane. Like it's not uncommon to see increases in muscle size of 1 to 300% over like 6 weeks, right? That's like if your muscle was, let's say, 10 units big at the start, After 6 weeks, it would be like 2 to 400 units big, or sorry, 20 to 40 units big. So that's a huge increase. It's not like a relative thing. Um, Whereas in humans, the actual hypertrophy observed from stretching is much smaller typically. So, for example, we have a meta-analysis by Panidi and colleagues on stretching, just stretching itself in humans, and whether or not it causes hypertrophy. And essentially, like we observe definitely less hypertrophy than from lifting. And secondly, that hypertrophy only really becomes meaningful when you do it at higher intensities or for higher durations. By higher durations, I mean over an hour and a half of stretching a week. Like with lengthened partials, you're lucky if you get an extra 2 minutes in the lengthened position per session. Like if that, right? And so the amount of stretching involved during lengthened partials in terms of duration just isn't sufficient to conform with what we think causes hypertrophy in humans from stretching. Like we would need way longer durations of stretching to see that stretch mediated hypertrophy occur. And likewise with lengthened partials, at least the way they've been studied, maybe not the way they're implemented nowadays by myself, for example, but at least the way they've been studied, they're very rarely actually being done at the longest possible muscle lengths, right? When you're stretching, you are by definition at the longest possible muscle lengths. When you're doing lengthened partials, the way we observe more hypertrophy in these studies, they're often doing them at like long-ish muscle lengths, not even at the longest muscle lengths. So all of this kind of goes against the idea that it's stretch-mediated hypertrophy, in addition to these findings, as I just mentioned, in the biceps, where it wasn't actually beneficial to go to the most lengthened position possible, especially it seems when it's done at the detriment of more tension. So as a random example, when you're doing a dumbbell fly, right? And you can get really deep. Let's say you have great mobility and you can go really deep in a dumbbell fly, and you can actually go past when your upper arm is parallel to the ground, right? When your upper arm is parallel to the ground, theoretically, that's when the moment arm is greatest. And let's say you can go deeper than this. You are stretching out your chest more, but the resistance is actually decreasing because the moment arm between your shoulder and the dumbbell is decreasing. Whether or not going deeper past just sort of parallel is causing more hypertrophy at this point, based on this research, I couldn't tell you for sure. It does seem like tension is the most important thing versus just purely maximizing muscle length. And no, it doesn't seem like lengthened partials are causing stretch mediated hypertrophy. Like it's just not, it doesn't seem logical at this point to make that jump. And so certain people online making claims using this as a basis, like for example, okay, stretch mediated hypertrophy only occurs in untrained lifters, and therefore lengthened partials only work in untrained lifters. That's likely an unwarranted jump in terms of, or leap of faith, because again, stretch mediated hypertrophy isn't really what's occurring here. But yeah, those are the results of the bicep study, minus the tangent that I just went on.
I really like that and I appreciate it because I think it's easy as someone who's not maybe as well read within the research or a researcher themselves, and they are a practitioner and I don't know, a social media influencer, to kind of hear some of this and then know of stretch mediated hypertrophy, and they just sound similar, and it's easy to be like, oh, we always knew about this. It's stretch mediated hypertrophy. Like, oh, we've got more research to back it up now. And yeah, I remember those old studies because I've spoken to Scott Stevenson. He often brings them up about weighing the bird's wings, and like it's just unbelievably cruel. And yeah, it's very interesting to know it's probably not the same mechanism, which I think is fascinating. But I think the really key take home from what you mentioned there is where there's people maybe seeking to get the biggest stretch possible, and they're kind of maybe hyper focused on that. And if that takes them away from tension, no longer a good trade-off anymore. I think that for me is very key.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, what I will point out is a couple of things. One, we didn't observe less hypertrophy. So it's not as though it was harming you to get your shoulder hyperextended and get more of a stretch. It certainly wasn't harming you, but it also didn't seem to benefit you. The second thing is that, like, how should I put this? I think that people sometimes forget there's relatively few exercises where just chasing pure muscle length will reduce tension, right? Like, even in the dumbbell fly example I gave earlier, most people can't really go much past parallel anyways, like just mobility wise. And then even if you do, you will still have that peak tension imposed at pretty long muscle lengths. And I'm not sure like you're making the lift meaningfully worse by just chasing pure muscle length. But like sometimes based on equipment constraints, you will have to make the choice between an exercise that is just stretching out the muscle, like an incline curl, and an exercise that is maybe not stretching it out so much, but that is placing more tension in that relatively stretched position, like a preacher curl. And in those situations, when you just have to decide between one and the other, you probably do want to pick the one that places more tension in that lengthened position. That's kind of my rough takeaway. I do still think like both are important, like both tension and muscle length, but some research now is suggesting that tension might be slightly more important than just purely maximizing stretch.
Well said. Out of interest, I'm just thinking practically with the dumbbell incline curl. Do you think there's a way of modifying such exercises so that you do get more tension in that position? Because when I think about doing it very strictly, yeah, it's dead at the bottom and then I curl up. But if I do it a little bit more with some momentum, I let my arms swing back a little bit more, maybe I'm able to kind of generate some tension in that stretch position a bit more.
Yeah, there's a couple of ways. One is the more practical way, and the other is the less practical way, but slightly better way. The more practical way is to potentially do partials. So just like essentially go up to like 90 degrees of elbow flexion. Like the resistance curve will still be hardest in that somewhat shortened position, but you're at least like cutting down range of motion so that it becomes somewhat harder in lengthened position, relatively speaking. Like you can use more weight, and therefore even the bottom position is a bit more challenging. The other way is just to use cables. And that's why I'm a relatively big fan of, like, I think I made a video where I declared the bench cable curl as being the best bicep exercise, just because you're essentially getting the best of both worlds. Like, assuming that both factors are important. Yes, tension is important, but so is muscle length. Then doing something like an incline curl, but with cables, where you can actually set up to have resistance at the bottom, might be the best, where you're able to get the extra stretch by having your shoulders behind you, hyperextended, lengthening the biceps even more. And you're also getting the extra tension by having the cable set up in a way that might maximize the resistance at the bottom, just like we did in the study.
Do you not see the progress you would like? Are you sick of writing your own programs? Or perhaps you need some accountability in order to stick with a plan? Then it's time to start working with us. We at Revive Stronger offer a truly personalized coaching service. You'll get more than just an email with some macros or random cookie cutter program. With Revive Stronger, you will be the center of our attention. You will receive your own fully individualized training protocol alongside a customized nutritional strategy. We created the coaching around your needs, wants, personal preferences, and your own unique lifestyle. Every single week, we delve into your program in order to make appropriate adjustments so that we get the most out of your time and the best possible outcome. We help both female and male athletes to seriously change their body composition by adding more muscle mass and decreasing fat tissue. No matter if you're a competitive bodybuilder or just want to look better, if you need help with your progress and taking your physique to the next level, our coaching is for you. It's time to make a change. Sign up today and let's revive stronger.
Yeah, I guess the way I was describing it is using momentum to help you get it short. So you're almost turning it into a bit of a lengthened partial by using that. And maybe it's a better stimulus to fatigue trade-off, if you use that terminology, to do it just a lengthened partial in that case.
Yeah, so it's interesting with the momentum thing. There's a few things I think about it. One is I do think it's worth being explosive out of that stress position. Like just thinking about accelerating the weight up as you start the rep is a good thing, because then essentially you're trying to maximize force output from the biceps in that lengthened position, and assuming time spent and tension produced in that lengthened position are both important for hypertrophy. And if we increase how much tension we're producing in that lengthened position, that's probably a good thing for hypertrophy. So being explosive out of that stretch position is a good thing. But when it comes specifically to momentum, there's a couple of sort of like asterisks I typically think of. One is using momentum at the very bottom. Oftentimes the way people implement that is using their hips, or using their, like, puffing out their chest, or essentially extending their spine, or potentially extending their knees, or going on their tippy toes when they're curling, or all sorts of things. All of these things, and I think you've had Dr. Pack on before to talk about technique for hypertrophy. We don't have direct studies on cheating for hypertrophy, like cheating your lifts and whether or not that's better or worse for hypertrophy than strict technique. But on a theoretical basis, involving other muscle groups, like whether it's extending your hips to get the weight up at the start of the rep or what have you, maybe not ideal, because you're essentially involving other muscle groups, reducing the odds that your target muscle group is the limiting factor, right? Like theoretically, we want to have the target muscle produce as much tension as possible so that by the end of the set, there's higher probabilities of it being the limiting factor and it being trained sufficiently close to failure to maximize hypertrophy, at least within a couple reps of failure. The more we involve other muscle groups, the less likely that becomes. It's not a huge concern, but it is probably something worth keeping in mind. There's also the additional fatigue consideration, as you mentioned, like when you're involving other muscle groups, how much stimulus are your glutes really getting from squeezing at the sort of curl? I don't know. But are they getting fatigued? Marginally, but probably. So yeah, just a few things. And then the final thing about cheating for hypertrophy is on almost every lift, pretty much everyone I've ever seen cheat, like curls, skull crushers, or what have you, they cheat at the start of the lift. Like essentially, you're kind of like extending your hips at the start of the lift, so you're reducing how much tension potentially your biceps have to produce at the start of the lift. Like very few people start cheating at the top of the rep, if that makes sense, to kind of overcome that shortened position. Most people cheat at the start of the rep to get a bit more momentum going, and that potentially could reduce how much effort you put into just actually using the muscle to accelerate the weight, as opposed to using some other muscle that you're not really trying to target. So I don't know. I think being explosive out of that starting position is a good thing, but I think trying intentionally to involve other muscles or use momentum, what have you, maybe not the best thing.
Cool. I think you covered the 3 studies there. If you're happy,
Yes.
I've got another question for you. So, and we've kind of been talking about it a little bit here, but it's talking about kind of making inferences from the studies that you've had so far. So, drawing principles from the studies on range of motion, for example, incorporating pauses at the stretch or incorporating partial movements just generally into a routine, such as like on back movements, focusing on the hardest part. So doing the first 50% and cutting out that hard, short position for that muscle group. How do you go about doing that? Like, what are your thoughts behind it?
So just the thoughts behind why I think there's a generalizable principle and how to implement it?
Yeah, I guess some people will be like, hey, they haven't looked at pausing it a stretch position. So how can you say that that's something to recommend when we haven't had direct literature on it? Drawing inferences in general from research papers, but specifically your area.
Sure. So first of all, I think those people absolutely have a point. And I've tried to generally recommend that people, hey, if you want to implement lengthened training, try lengthened partials first, right? Or try selecting movements that are inherently lengthened partials, or just that focus on lengthened position a bit more, because we do have comparisons of more lengthened movements to more shortened movements. Like, for example, a couple of studies on push downs versus overhead extensions. Like, for example, the study on the squat versus hip thrust for certain exercises. Like, we have certain studies looking at different exercises, and generally across those studies, the movements that lengthen the muscle more are better for hypertrophy, right?
Leg curl, lying leg curl, one springs
There
to
we
mind
see
as
the
well.
leg curl. Yeah, there you go. Yep, there you go. So we have those studies, but I think that the most direct way is to use lengthened partials within your training, because we have 5 studies comparing lengthened partials to full range of motion. We have like 10 studies comparing lengthened partials and shortened partials. So we do have those studies. I've tried to make clear that things like tempo and lengthened supersets or other techniques are more of an adjunct way of applying this stuff, because we simply don't have the evidence. And so I think those people absolutely have a point. But equally, I think that you do sometimes have to think in terms of what is the underlying mechanism here. And mechanisms kind of exist on a sort of tier list, I guess, or kind of like an order almost, where you can talk about mechanisms in terms of, all right, what's actually happening at the physiological level now that is causing more muscle growth to occur. That's sort of like the physiological mechanism for why one training strategy might cause more hypertrophy. But on a more practical level, you can also think about different forms of training, right? Like, for example, you think about, all right, why does higher volume training typically seem to cause more hypertrophy than lower volume training? And you can be like, okay, well, I could think about it in terms of mTOR pathway signaling and try and figure out why is more volume causing more hypertrophy. But that's kind of like the 8th step or something in that equation of why is this causing this, right? You could also look at it from sort of like first line mechanism, which is more volume, more tension. And tension is probably the most established way of causing muscles to grow. And so that's like a very simple way of understanding why could more volume cause more hypertrophy. Likewise, with longer muscle length training and the studies on lengthened partials or lengthened isometrics versus shortened isometrics, or lengthened partials versus shortened partials, or different movements even, where, for example, if you're talking about I don't know, like a leg extension or a leg press, these movements do differ in several ways. But one of them, for most people, is going to be muscle length. Most people can get deeper on the average leg press than the average leg extension. And so when you look at all of these bodies of evidence that at least have some comparison of different muscle length training, you do see that generally longer muscle length training causes more hypertrophy across different conditions, right? Like whether we're talking about different muscle actions, like isometrics versus dynamic contractions, where you're involving both the concentric and the eccentric phase, or different exercises potentially that have different things that separate them beyond just muscle length being trained. So it appears to be a generalizable principle. At which point you need to think, all right, well, what kind of unites all of these findings? What's being manipulated that happens? What's the common denominator, really? And it seems to be the muscle length being trained, right? So you're spending more time in the lengthened position. And so theoretically, any way to increase that proportion of time and effort spent in the lengthened position should help. Is it the first line treatment for someone with small arms? No, that's still lengthened partials. But like, it is worth considering why it's happening so that people have a more diverse set of tools to work with. So that as coaches, you can recommend different things based on circumstances, based on equipment and everything else. You're able to say, all right, you don't want to do lengthened partials. What else could you do that could still ultimately get us to that desirable adaptation of getting bigger, you know?
Yeah, I think that makes so much sense. I mean, yeah, you brought up volume there actually, and it's like we have general recommendations on volume for every muscle group, but not every muscle group's been trained, because we have a general principle that's like, hey, it seems higher volumes lead to more growth if you're recovering, and that can be a nuanced discussion, but we still have that generalizable principle.
Yeah, and we'll never, hopefully at some point, but I don't think we'll get to a point anytime soon where we have comparisons of every exercise in every muscle group in every population. There's always going to be some degree of inference that has to be made. And you do still want to look for generalizable principles, especially when, to be honest, they are as apparent as they are in the muscle length research. Like, I can think of very few areas of evidence where the research is as consistent as this one. Like higher versus lower volumes. Yeah, we have research on different volume training, and generally higher volume training causes more growth. But then when you get to like the higher volumes of like 20 plus sets versus under 20 sets, we have like 8 studies, for example, and 4 of them find more hypertrophy by and large from 20 plus sets. But then 4 also found no difference essentially. So like, compare that to muscle length or range of motion, where out of, I think, 10 studies on shortened partials versus lengthened partials, 9 find more hypertrophy from lengthened partials. Or in the isometric data, it's a similar amount of consistency. Or for range of motion versus lengthened partials, very high amount of consistency in terms of 4 out of 5 studies finding more hypertrophy from lengthened partials. And so, like, when you look at all these studies together, you're like, wait a minute, this is actually a very consistent finding. And so that is highly indicative of some sort of generalizable principle that likely applies across at least a few different contexts, and that you can apply in your training to make more gains.
So I think you've done a fantastic job of updating us on the current literature, and we've obviously dug through that a little bit. And we've talked about some of the general application of this, but I don't know if you already have it in your head, because I imagine you think about this a lot. But what are your general best practices for people regarding range of motion within their hypertrophy training?
Yeah. And that's where it gets a bit dicey, right? Because like many people are still attached to the idea of full range of motion being the de facto standard. And I think that's fine. Like, we're not talking necessarily about a ton more hypertrophy with lengthened partials for full range of motion. And depending on your goals, full range of motion can be totally appropriate. If, for example, you're trying to get stronger in a full range of motion, or like more functional, whatever that means, full range of motion can be totally fine. But I do personally think at this point that the evidence is quite compelling that we want to emphasize the stretch in some capacity. I think if you, let's say, Steve, you right now, you were about to turn on me and you're about to red team me, and you're like, look, I'm going to prove this cunt, sorry for the language, wrong, okay? And you're like, let me use evidence to prove my point. You would have a tough time. You would have a really tough time to tell me that actually not including lengthened position is best for hypertrophy. It would just be a really, really tenuous argument. There's just not really any consistent evidence to make that claim. However, on the flip side, the argument that the lengthened position is important and needs to be included for hypertrophy is pretty strong. That means that full range of motion is a great approach because it includes that lengthened position. But there are now a few studies that look at the idea of going even past that point and just including the relatively stretched positions, like doing lengthened partials. And those studies also seem to find usually more hypertrophy from doing that versus doing some lengthened training and some shortened training. And even studies like the Pedrosa study, where they compared bottom half partials to top half partials, to doing half their training in the bottom half their training in the top half, to doing a 4-range of motion, still found the best hypertrophy by and large from the lengthened position. And so at this point, my personal training, I just do lengthened partials. I just do half reps on every movement pretty much. Like I've done some strength training for the fun of it, but like for hypertrophy, I just do lengthened partials. And so I think if you want to maximize hypertrophy, including some lengthened partials is a good idea. I couldn't tell you with high confidence that only lengthened partials is what will optimize your hypertrophy. But you also couldn't tell me with high confidence that only for range of motion will optimize your hypertrophy, or even that you need a split of both, or that you should be doing a split of both. Like there hasn't been a study so far looking at combining full range of motion lengthened partials. So like alternative stances are equally or more tentative, right? Because the most direct research on range of motion seems to suggest that lengthened partials exclusively lead to more hypertrophy than exclusively full range of motion. And so in my own training, I'm just doing lengthened partials for hypertrophy. And I am biasing my exercise selection to include and emphasize the stretch position, whether that's doing reverse Nordic curls or sissy squats over leg extensions, whether that's doing overhead extensions over dumbbell kickbacks or what have you. Those exercise selection choices and that range of motion that I use is heavily in favor of the lengthened position. I think at this point, you should at the very least be using a full range of motion, like almost all the time, and very strongly consider incorporating lengthened partials. Like whether it's as partials after your full range of motion set, like just at the end of your set, whether it's as partials as standalone, which is what I still recommend now, you very likely want to include them if you want to maximize hypertrophy. If you're still a bit skeptical, and I know some people are, you don't have to make your whole training routine lengthened partials. You will likely see a dose-response relationship in terms of how much additional hypertrophy you see based on how much of an emphasis you put on lengthened position. So let's say you're just kind of skeptical. Even if you only turn, say, 25% of your training into lengthened partials or just heavily focus on lengthened position, you will still see a benefit. And so if that's what you're comfortable with, that's what you should do. But personally, and this is very much a stance open to revision, like if more research comes out and it's like, oh, actually it only happens in untrained lifters, like several studies come out just saying that's the case, or we get studies saying that actually it's only in these muscle groups, so what have you, I'll change my stance. But at this point, if you want to optimize hypertrophy, I couldn't make an argument that you would be missing out on growth if you did lengthened partials or just did lengthened partials. I can't. And anecdotally, I've been doing it for like a year and a half now. I've grown just fine, the same amount as I would as an advanced lifter that's been training for 10 years, which is to say not that much, but still some growth. So yeah, focus on the stretch, however much you're comfortable with. There's a good chance that you'll maximize hypertrophy by just doing lengthened partials. There's a good chance that you may just want to emphasize it a little bit. That's the general consensus, I'd say.
I find it very interesting that people do hold on so strongly to full range of motion. I have asked a lot of people on this podcast, experts within the field, tons of experience, coach loads of people, and it is interesting to me how skeptical a lot of people have been, because given the state of the research, I would feel people have that, it would be more appropriate to have that skepticism to full range of motion. Yep. Because of the research as it stands. So it's very interesting to me. I don't know if it's like anecdote that is holding people, tying people, tradition.
It's just tradition, because like every time we've tested full range of motion against other approaches, right? Like, yeah, full range of motion seems better than shortened partials. But every time we've tested it against lengthened partials, it's never caused more hypertrophy. And it genuinely does somewhat just seem to be attachment to tradition and like fear of, okay, I'm going to adopt this new thing now, and it's going to cause less hypertrophy, and I'm going to look like a fool, right? But all the comparisons we have don't point towards you missing out on growth. They just don't. And so I do just think it's tradition.
And I'm in a similar boat to you, especially the movements where it's hardest in that short position. They're just all partials in my training. So back, delts, biceps, calves, like they're all partials.
Let's use your N of one. You know?
I seem to look like I've grown, but again, I've been training for like 15 years. So yeah, it's hard
always hard to tell, for sure.
Especially calves. I mean, the not that you're a huge fan of this, we won't go down that rabbit hole, but the pump disruption sensation within the calves have been nothing like full range of motion training. It's been obscene, the pumps that I get in my calves. They visually look like they've grown. I haven't measured them because, again, advanced bodybuilder, not worrying about
the
seeing no
judges don't
measurement
measure you on
change.
stage, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
The judges look at your calves and you're like, wow, Steve, you've grown. That's great.
Visually, they've definitely grown. I'm excited to see when I strip down this year, the body fat that is, my back, and see how that's come on, especially like the lats and everything like that. Delts visibly absolutely grown, and this is the most I've ever done cables and biasing that lengthened position. So I've definitely seen some good things there. One area where I've not been skeptical, but I just haven't necessarily enjoyed, and I haven't theoretically seen the benefit as strongly for lengthened partials, is things where it's already kind of a lengthened partial, like a leg press or a squat pattern, or
Sure.
pressing movements in general.
I'll tell you what about that. That is in line with the research I mentioned around the tension being important. Like, where, for example, in the cable curl, going from just having a setup where it's already very challenging at the bottom to getting even more of a stretch, or essentially spending more of your time in the stretch position, not being beneficial necessarily, or at least not costing you anything, but not improving your hypertrophy. Because in those movements, like most leg pressing, most squatting, most chest pressing, you're talking about movements that are quite challenging in that stretch position and not so much in the shortened position. And so if you were to switch from a full range of motion to just doing lengthened partials, you're going from, say, spending half of your time in that lengthened position in a movement that is already lengthened biased to spending all of your time. So essentially, you can think of it as shifting the average muscle length being trained to being longer, just like in that comparison of the cable curl, where you're either doing it with your arm by your side or your arm behind you. And those movements are already hardest in that lengthened position. So maybe for those movements, it doesn't make a difference, right? Like, I can't think of too many studies off the top of my head that have looked at those sort of movements. So it might be the case that for those, it doesn't make a difference, right? Like, just like for the cable curl that I mentioned, where it's already hardest in that stretch position, doing lengthened partials on that maybe doesn't add anything extra. Maybe you've kind of maxed out those benefits. And at the very least, that is where you'd also theoretically expect to see the least benefit. So I couldn't at this point say that you're definitely missing out on something by doing full range of motion on those movements. There's a chance that you're getting the same hypertrophy. There's a chance that you'd be getting more hypertrophy with partials, but I think it's less clear cut than for other movements.
Yeah. I think that's fair, and that's kind of the reason I've gone down it and just ended up preferring it. There's practically doing some of those movements like hip hinging, like the leg pressing and stuff. They're pretty hard doing them as just lengthened partials. I've tried it, and maybe it's something I use as a variation in future if more research comes out. And I'm glad you said that with your position, by the way, because I think some people will feel like you are the lengthened partials guy and you're going to start your own brand of team lengthened partials. But I'm glad clearly updating your stance based off new research is so key. So I'm glad you mentioned that.
Hey, that is until I start with the t-shirts, and then the millions will be rolling in, and then I'm all in, baby. You know, I follow the money. That's all I do.
One last thing on the practical side. I think Kasim's done some really interesting stuff, and I know you've spent some time with him and discussed things with him at his kind of quote-unquote lab, in a sense, where he's been trying to find what maximizes time at that long length. So using things like lengthened partials versus full ROM versus maybe like 1.5 reps. Mm-hmm. Do you think using like a 1.5 rep, if that allows you to spend more time on average in that longer muscle length, could be something like super beneficial for that movement that is like that squat pattern? Or is it just like at this point you're like, hey, there's not enough to say it's superior, it's just maybe a variation you could play around with?
Yeah, so there's a few things. One, if it allows you to get more lengthened partials in than just doing partials at the end of the set, there's a chance that it would be better than that. Now, when it comes to the idea that this is the way you should implement lengthened training in general, I'm skeptical for the same reasons I've mentioned earlier, which is that we don't have any research on this. So while we can kind of think that it probably works based on the same generalizable principle as we've established, you probably want to be a bit more cautious around that application versus something like lengthened partials that we've actually studied directly. It's difficult for me to answer the question of whether or not it would be beneficial, because we're also shifting the goalpost for failure quite a bit. And by the way, that also applies to lengthened partials, and that might be part of the benefit, is that for some movements at least, you're essentially going past full range of motion failure, right? So you're getting more stimulus on account of that. And that's, for example, the case with the calf raise study I mentioned, where they were going past full range of motion failure intentionally. But even when you're just doing lengthened partials for certain movements, you might no longer have been able to do a full rep like 5 reps ago, and you're still doing partials. You're still pumping them out. So that might be part of the benefit. But equally, that benefit would also be a double-edged sword in the case that going past failure and going closer to failure in general also tends to cause more fatigue. Like, for example, in that recent Rafalo study, they also measured the repetition drop-off from set 1 to set 4 when going closer to failure or to failure versus just going close-ish to failure. And they saw that that difference in fatigue was still the case even at the end of the study. So while you might think, oh, it gets less fatiguing over time, it may or may not. And so maybe doing those integrated partials would cause more stimulus, and it stands to reason. I think it's a reasonable claim to make. But I do wonder how it interacts with fatigue in general. So yeah, just alongside that reservation of how it interacts with fatigue, the fact that we haven't studied yet, I think it's a fine approach. Personally, I still prefer lengthened partials just because that is the way it's been studied. That's where we've observed hypertrophy differences. But yeah, I think it's an interesting strategy to take on movements, potentially, for example, where you're not comfortable going to failure with just partials. Like if I'm doing a free weight squat and I was just doing partials, I'm not sure I'd be having a great time, because then at the end of the set, if I failed, I'd have to drop the bar behind me, and if nothing else, I don't want to be that guy in the gym. But then if I was doing integrated partials, maybe I could get also an emphasis on the stretch, but then I could just end the set with a full rep and re-rack it. There's certain movements where it might be more conducive to being used, but on principle, I don't think it should take the place of lengthened partials altogether.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. And then actually, I said that was my last question. This might be the last one. But I was going to ask you, and obviously you're training right now, you're not incorporating any short bias movements, and people do still seem to think that there might be a place for that. The only practical thoughts I have on it are, for example, like a hip thrust, maybe because that isolates the glutes. Maybe you could argue there's other ways to isolate the glutes and train them at a longer muscle length. And then the other thought is potentially it's, like you mentioned, in terms of fatigue, when you bias the short position, it's a bit less fatiguing. So maybe it allows you to accumulate a little bit more volume without that little bit of fatigue. I mean, that extra fatigue that comes along with it.
Sure. So I think both of those are relatively open questions, actually. And I think you did a good job of sort of clarifying that they're speculative. So first of all, I don't include any shortened training in my routine, like unless you count sometimes doing full reps on squats or what have you. That's about as shortened as I get, I guess. But then when it comes to those two benefits you mentioned, let's take them one by one. With regards to isolating certain muscle groups, that may or may not be true, right? Like, for example, the hip thrust rationale is somewhat predicated on the idea that, one, you're just performing hip extension, and there's only a select few muscle groups that can perform that, namely the glute max, the adductor magnus, and the hamstrings, right? By and large. And so it's based on the idea that you're just doing hip extension and not knee extension. So in a squat, for example, your quads could give out first. In the hip thrust, you're just doing hip extension. So theoretically, your hip extensors would give out first, right? So it's kind of isolating those a bit more. But then the second assumption that's baked into the hip thrust as being like very effective for glute hypertrophy specifically, and by the way, it is. Like we have one study by Plotkin and colleagues, who I think you've had on the podcast before potentially.
Sure. Yeah.
Where they observed specifically a lot of a decent amount of glute hypertrophy, and very little adductor or quad hypertrophy or hamstring hypertrophy even. So it does seem to be good at isolating glute growth, but I think there is a general assumption underlying that idea, which is that with a hip thrust, the reason people think it's good for glutes and not adductors and so forth is because of some research on internal moment arms of the glutes versus adductors at different degrees of hip flexion. And specifically when your hips are more flexed, like at the very bottom of an RDL, some research suggests that the adductors have greater internal leverage to produce hip extension torque, right? And so theoretically, the adductors would be more involved in producing hip extension torque at the bottom of an RDL, whereas the glutes would kick in more at the top, right? Because they have greater internal leverage. And so essentially, we're talking about the principle of neuromechanical matching, which has been put forth by some people. the truth is, we don't really have evidence for that being like something that is definitely causing differences in hypertrophy. And so while you could say, well, the glutes have greater leverage when your hips are quite extended at shorter muscle lengths. And so if we want to isolate the glutes, we should be training them mostly in that position via hip thrust, for example, or even a glute bridge if you want to take it to another extreme. I don't know that we have the evidence to make that claim currently. Like, I don't know that I'm sold on it. I think that just training a muscle's function and specifically working it in a single joint movement where you're just performing hip extension will probably isolate it about as much as you can. And if you take the set to failure, all of the hip extensors or the muscle groups that can perform that function will be trained close to failure, right? Like you'll recruit your hamstrings, your adductors, and your glutes quite a bit and fatigue them quite a bit if you take that set to failure, because all of them need to kick in until you can't produce enough force anymore to even lift the weight. Like your body, at least the way I think about it, and until we have further evidence, that's kind of how I think about this. Your body isn't going to be like, okay, I'm really struggling to lift this weight now, but I'm trying to lift it. Let me only use the muscle that has great leverage. No, your body would use every muscle it possibly can, get every hand on deck to lift that weight. Whether or not it has great leverage is kind of secondary, right? Like, sure, if you're doing a very submaximal task, like walking around or what have you, yeah, your body's probably going to prioritize the muscles that have greatest leverage to preserve energy and just generally be an efficient human, right? And evolutionarily, that makes sense. But then if you're performing a task to failure, it would make sense that your body would get all hands on deck. And so I personally think if you want an isolated movement, short muscle lengths, probably not that critical. Just performing an isolated joint function like hip extension for hip extensors or bicep curls for the biceps as opposed to doing like a back movement, right? Because if you get more things involved, there's a lower likelihood of the target muscle being a limiting factor because other things can give up first. And then when it comes to fatigue, that is also a bit of an open question. So there's actually been a study published like 2 weeks ago at this point by McMahon and colleagues looking at the fatigue caused by longer and shorter muscle length training, finding that at least acutely, longer muscle length training does cause greater fatigue as measured by a variety of different proxies. I think right now my stance is that longer muscle length training is probably a bit more fatiguing or likely more fatiguing, at least when you first perform it. Whether or not that generalizes out onto longer time scales, I couldn't say for sure. So yeah, one study I would be interested in seeing at some point is comparing shorter and longer muscle length training when you don't match for volume, right? And that's something that actually I've spoken about with Brett Contreras, where he does want to see a study in glutes, for example, where you're comparing a group training at lower muscle lengths or stretch position and a group training more the peak squeeze. And because we think the peak squeeze might be less fatiguing, the peak squeeze group actually gets to do more sets overall because they can do more because they're not as fatigued, right? I think it's a bit of an open question. I'm curious to see more research in that vein, and I'm not sure how that generalizes out onto the longer term. But I think it's worth keeping in mind, at least if you notice. I haven't noticed this, and I'm not sure what your experience is, and you can speak to this since you've been doing a lot of stretch training for your back, side delts, and so forth. But I personally haven't experienced that like I'm doing fewer sets than before, like at least not substantially. Initially, I think I did experience a bit more soreness, but even now it's not even that big of a difference, if any. So I don't know. I'm not entirely sold on either the isolation argument or the fatigue, but both could still be true.
Yeah, I think that's well stated. And I'm the same as you. I think initially, I think about this, I just recently incorporated back extensions. And I know because of the stretch that I get on my hamstrings, like I know I'm going to get a lot of novelty and damage and soreness. But as I adapt to that, it no longer... I need more than one set to really feel like I've got my due diligence there. But if I chuck in 3 initially, yeah, it's going to cause me a problem. And it's the same here with like long muscle length partials. I think if people just suddenly switch all their sets straight to partials, yeah, they might end up feeling a bit screwed up. But if they take a set off, say, over, I think they're probably going to be able to get that set back on within weeks. So I haven't found that my sets are way less, and I feel way more beat up from doing the lengthened partials personally either.
Yeah, no, that's been my experience by and large. And by the way, that's not to say I discount the idea that, hey, hip thrust, for example, could be a great tool or like specifically great because they train the glutes at short muscle lengths in that hip extension position. That could be the case. Like, could turn out to be the case that if you want to isolate a given muscle, there are certain joint angles that are better to do so. versus just actually performing its function. But I'm not sold on that. And similarly with the fatigue argument, I think before I can make that recommendation that, hey, you should definitely include some shorter muscle length training because it's less fatiguing and therefore you can get more volume in and therefore see more hypertrophy, I would need to see some sort of research actually looking at that before we can make that conclusion. Just like we're waiting for even more research on lengthened training before we can for sure say that, hey, lengthened training is all you should do for hypertrophy, you know?
Yeah, I think that's really well said. And I think to wrap this up, I look at your perspective as definitely don't miss out on the long muscle lengths, whether that's full ROM or you do partials. Definitely getting those long muscle lengths, especially if you can with tension, so selecting movements that allow you to do that. And biasing most of your training towards that, especially on those movements that are hardest in short, like think about incorporating some length and partials, so those pulling motions, the calves, the biceps, the delts, those sort of areas. And if you want to incorporate some short bias movements, you can do that, but don't make it kind of the overwhelming focus of your program. And we'll have to just wait and see what more research comes out. Thank you so much, Milo, for your time. I think this has been a great catch up and an episode I wanted to do because, yeah, since you've first been talking about it, there's been a lot of kind of hype and people have been saying it's in vogue and it's a trend, and I'm like, it's definitely not. There's like a building wealth of evidence here, and I'm excited for when those unpublished studies you spoke about become published, because I think it's just going to move more and more people in that direction. And yeah, I appreciate your time.
Sure, man. And final thing on that note is, if you do want to check out the studies protocols, we can link a few pre-registrations, because we actually pre-register these studies as a means to make them a bit more rigorous and methodical and what have you. So yeah, we can link those below.
Absolutely. And I would be remiss to do this, but you've been putting out tons of content over on social media, specifically your YouTube channel, more than I can actually keep up with, but I've checked out a few, and I mean, the production's great. It's actually improved since you started as well. So I want to make sure that people know if they want to keep up with what you're doing, where you're at. I also know you have recently launched, or you are launching your app as well, Myo Adapt. I heard about that, which sounds exciting.
That is correct. So first of all, thank you for plugging my YouTube. You can find me on YouTube at Wolf Coaching. That's my last name in coaching. Putting out 4 videos a week at the moment, so plenty of information there. More than most people can probably keep up with. I don't blame you. And then for a training app that I'll be launching in the next few months, if you'd like to be notified when it comes out, just go to myoadapt.com and sign up for the email newsletter. You'll just get an email when it gets released, and you can log in at a lower price than any time else, essentially. But yeah, it's been an honor, Steve. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Milo. And thank you guys for listening. I'll make sure that's all linked below, and we'll catch you next time.
Losing weight fast while maintaining muscle mass. Sounds too good to be true, doesn't it? It isn't though. It's reality, and we know how to do it, and we will help you achieve this. The Minicut movement is an 8-week fat loss program to make you lose a huge chunk of fat while maintaining muscle mass at the same time. We will support you from the beginning to the end so that you see the results you would like to and come out of it much stronger. You'll receive a fully automated spreadsheet that is based on your nutritional needs. You can choose between 6 different male and female training templates. Over 30 videos will guide you through each and every single step of the Minicut so that you're getting the most out of your journey and that you always know what to do. But the best thing is that you can start whenever you want. The Minicut movement is open 24/7. So if you want to learn more or you're ready to sign up, hit the link in the description below. So let's revive stronger together.